Greek theater was theater of convention, in which neither scenery or costumes were represented in any kind of detail. The audience just accepted descriptions in poetic dialogue without demanding to see any of those objects that were described. Imagination was the key in this kind of theater, and these are the elements that we are going to examine in this PowerPoint. We're going to look at playwrights, people who first started it, and then we'll matriculate into Roman theater. In ancient Greek theater, there were no barriers between the performing area and the auditorium. The audience on the hillside had an unbroken view of the actor in the chorus. And one of the interesting things that I found out is that if you stood right in the center of the orchestra or the dancing circle, dancing place, everyone could hear you, even to the top of that theatron. So as we examine this, we're going to look at all of these playwrights, one of our first playwrights, in Aristotle's theory of tragedy. According to Aristotle, Thespis was a singer of songs and stories from mythology. He was in the chorus. Thespis supposedly introduced this new style in which one singer or actor performed the words of an individual character. Some of the things that I've read talked about him stepping out of the chorus and becoming the first actor to take on the character of Dionysus. And this new style that he supposedly discovered was called tragedy, and he was the first one who won the tragic competition. And this is one of the reasons why we call actors thespians. It's based on Thespis first stepping out of the chorus and taking on the role of one of the actors. He was a singer of dithyrambics. He won the first tragic competition, and it's not as if there weren't plays before and people acting them out, but he was the first actor in a written play, and that's what made him so important. Aeschylus was born in 525 BC. He wrote the earliest plays that we have, and he was born to an aristocratic family. He fought in battles, but when he came back, he started playwriting, and he infused some of his works with the misery of wars, not just the glories. His characters were larger than life, and he was the first one that really introduced the second actor into the acting space. The choruses had more than 50 people, and what you need to understand about choruses, they were the ideal audience. They made commentary. They also commented not only for themselves but for the audience. But in addition, Aeschylus wrote 90 plays, and the reason why we know this is because the Greeks kept records of all of these plays, but we only have 7 plays left. And he wrote some of his plays in a trilogy, and that would be kind of like a mini-series on television for us. But basically, his types were idealized, and he focused on intellect as opposed to the feeling of the play. Now, his trilogy covered a play called Agamemnon, and it tells about the murder of a king, and the second one about how his son Orestes killed Agamemnon's murderers, and the third is about the nasty goddess called Furies, who chased Orestes until the gods put everything right. One of the things that I was really interested in is how he asked these two main questions. How responsible are we for our own actions, and how subject are we to uncontrollable forces? And when you think about the times that he wrote these questions, these are questions that we still ask ourselves today. Sophocles is the second playwright that I would like to speak to, not to be confused with Socrates. Socrates was a philosopher. Sophocles wrote more than 120 plays. He lived until he was 90 years old. We only have 7 of his tragedies and part of a satyr play. He's the most famous for writing the play Oedipus the King. He was also the playwright who introduced a third actor, reduced the chorus even more, and in addition, he invented scene painting. He added scene painting. For him, his plays were a little bit subtle, and he increased the complexity of the plot and he also wanted more realism in his performances. The Oedipus series, if you can remember, or if you've ever heard of Oedipus, if you think about Freud, he talks about the Oedipus complex. He based it on Sophocles' play. Euripides also wrote about 90 plays, and we have 17 of those tragedies and one satyr play. He wrote about some women in Greek myths like Electra and Medea, and he made men and women from myths seem really ordinary instead of the grand gods that we've heard about, like Dionysus and Hera and Zeus. In addition to that, he presented his first set of tragedies in 455 BC, but we didn't see him win until 441. He only won 5 awards, and he didn't get the 5th award until after he died, mostly because he was not as well liked in his lifetime like Aeschylus and Sophocles. And Euripides tended to ignore the judges of the festival, and he didn't cater to the crowd, and so they didn't approve very much of what he wrote until after he died. He was a pacifist, he was a free thinker, and coming from a system that was set about war, it was very, very difficult for people to like his work. He relied less on the chorus, and so he wanted more tolerance than he wanted the violence that was in some of the plays, and that's why he chose to live a lot of his life alone with his books on an island. Tragedies were not the only works produced in the theater of the classical era in Athens. The Athenians were extremely fond of comedies, and Aristophanes was one of their most favorite comic writers or playwright. He had 40 comedies, and we have 11 of his comedies that survive. Fortunately, by most accounts, Aristophanes was considered the greatest comic writer of his day. But by the time he started to write his comedies, democracy had begun to sour for Athenians, and people were increasingly demoralized by the conflicts of the Peloponnesian Wars and the loss of their greatest hero. Pericles had been taken from them and replaced by unscrupulous politicians. And because of that, some of the things that he would write about, Aristophanes would write about, he would satirize what was happening within the Athenian society. Some of his plays were not welcomed by some of the politicians. His greatest play, however, that he wrote was called Lysistrata, and he used that as a commentary on what was happening at the time of the Peloponnesian Wars. And basically, he used it as a way to mourn what was happening. And Lysistrata was written 21 years into the Peloponnesian Wars, and it revolved around women of Athens who tired of losing their sons on the battlefield. So what they did is they conspired to deny their husbands sexual intercourse until they made peace with the Spartans. Lysistrata is the one who led the revolt, and she's one of the most complete, realized characters throughout the play. And even though it's written lightheartedly, it's mostly written out of his grief over the thousands of Athenians who lost their lives. At the age of 18, Aristotle entered Plato's academy and soon became his top student. He spent about 20 years there. And though Aristotle criticized many of Plato's theory, he was always careful to acknowledge the fact that they shared common ground. And although he did depart from some of Plato's thoughts, the reason why I bring him up is because he is the one that defined tragedy for us, and we still use it today. He says tragedy is an imitation of action that is serious and complete and of a certain type of magnitude. And he said that tragedy has to have 6 parts, and those are the things that we're going to examine at this time. Okay, his 6 elements of tragedy are: it has to have plot, character, thought, diction, and melody. Aristotle felt like this had to be the order in order for tragedy to be complete and to really be performed well by any Greek actor. Now, in plot alone, this is the one that has the most sections of it. And so I want to take the time to explain it to you so that you'll understand it. The plot, the definition of plot, it is the structure of the play. Now, know that these things of plot don't have to happen in this particular order. Denouement, of course, the end of the movie. But then when you look at some of the movies like Momentum or the end of the play, Momentum started at the end of the movie and then backtracked. Pulp Fiction did some of the same things. You didn't really know what happened. It started with the end and backtracked, and then you saw the beginning. So, plot, definition, structure of the play. Exposition tells the audience what has gone on before. It catches you up. It tells you about character personalities, relationships, and backgrounds so that when you get to the point of attack, that's the moment the story begins, or that inciting incident. It's the first little incident that makes the story move from to the present on to the future. The complications are obstacles which the main character has to overcome. Those are new developments. That could be a new person arise, a situation, and sometimes we'll see other complications added in for a secondary plot. The conflict is the tension of the play. This is the opposition that must be resolved. It's the problem that the main character, that's the protagonist, has to overcome, has to achieve in the story. What's their goal? And really, goal. No play can exist without conflict, because if it didn't have conflict, we'd be very bored. The next thing that we're going to look at is suspense. And in order for us to really watch a play, it has to have some kind of anxiety, that give and take, some foreshadowing and discovery in its points of interest that keeps us aroused as an audience. So, suspense is sustained anxiety over the developing conflict. Sustained anxiety over developing conflict. Now, the crisis is a confrontation. This is a change of equilibrium. This is at some point where something must happen. You can't go back. Usually you have a letdown of tension, so you think, okay, things are a little bit better. And then it brings this confrontation right up to the point of this crisis that tells you things have to change. The highest point of tension and the intensity of the play is climax, and this usually happens with a major turn in a plot. It's a reversal, is you think you have it figured out, and then all of a sudden the climax comes and the person that you thought was the murderer wasn't the murderer, because all of the clues pointed in one direction and not another. That's where the reversal comes in. And the denouement is the untying of the final complications. That is the resolution, the end of your play, and he says that this is how plot, the structure of the play, must be set up. The second characteristic of Aristotle's theory of tragedy is character. Character is the primary material from which the plots are created, because incidents are developed through the speech and the behavior of the characters. It is anything that delineates a person or differentiates that person from others, and it operates on 4 levels. The first level of characterization is physical or biological. It defines your gender, your age, your size, your coloration, and your general appearance. Sometimes a playwright doesn't supply all of this information, but once the play is produced, then actors give the necessary physicality to the presence of that character. The second is societal. What this does is this includes the character's economic status, their profession or trade, what their religion is, and what their family relationships are, and all of the factors that place this character in a particular social environment. The third level is psychological. What this does is, I really like this one because this reveals a character's habitual responses, what they desire, their motivation, their likes and dislikes, and it looks at the inner workings of the mind. And because drama often arises from the conflicting desires that the characters have, then the psychological is the most essential level of characterization. The fourth and final level is moral. I think this one is also important because what it also does is it reveals what characters are willing to do to get what they want. It also shows what characters actually do when they're faced with what they get or when they're faced with a difficult choice. The moral decisions that these characters make, it differentiates them from each other because the deliberations that they make and the decisions that they use, it causes the character to examine their values and motives. And in that process, what happens is they reveal the truth to themselves and to the audience. The moral level is developed probably more fully in serious plays, although we do see that development in comedy and melodrama. A playwright will look at those four levels and then they will develop a few of those traits, and it depends on how they want the character portrayed, whether we see all four of these functions fully developed within the play. But let's look at the functions, because for example, the audience needs to know very little about a maid who appears only to say, "Dinner is served." Whereas if we're looking at the principal character, then what we want to know is what the depth is, and that's what's going to draw us in as the audience member. And usually we see a character is revealed in these four ways: through the descriptions in the stage directions, or in the preface material, or in the explanation material that's not a part of the dialogue. Then we hear the character themselves. We look at what the character says to see how they reveal themselves. We also look at what other people in the play say about the character. And mostly, the most important thing that we look at is the action of the character, what the character does. And dramatic characters usually are typified by their individualization and how they're socialized within the system of the play that we're looking at. A playwright may be concerned with making characters sympathetic or unsympathetic. And normally when we see that, sympathetic characters are given major virtues with a few minor foibles, whereas the reverse is true of unsympathetic character. When we look at melodrama or tragedy, melodrama oversimplifies these four elements that I talked about: the psychological, the moral, the societal, and the physical. Whereas tragedy normally depicts more complex forces at work, both within the character and without the character, and that's why that requires a greater range of characterization. The third basic element of Aristotle's theory of tragedy is thought. Thought includes the themes, arguments, and overall meaning of the action. It is present in all the plays, even in the most light-hearted farce, because a playwright cannot avoid expressing some attitudes, because events and characterizations always imply some kind of view of human behavior. As we've already seen, thought may also be used to unify a play's dramatic action. Now, Greek playwrights made extensive use of the chorus, a group representing some segment of society, just as those later periods the later periods of Shakespeare, employed such devices as soliloquies and asides, and these are forms of statements that are made directly to the audience. Other tools for projecting meaning are allegory and symbol. In allegory, characters are personifications of abstract qualities like mercy and greed and so on, such as in medieval plays of Everyman. A symbol is an object or an event or image that, although meaningful in itself, also suggests a concept of relationships. And so just as the play implies or states meaning, we should not conclude that there is a single correct interpretation for the play. Most plays permit multiple interpretations as different productions of and critical essays about the same play clearly indicate. So each interpretation of the script should always be supported by evidence that's found in the script.